if you have a dispute with the insurance company about what they'll cover while you're getting sued, that's also a problem because now you're fighting a two-front war.
Welcome to the Freedom Point Real Estate Podcast, where we talk about creating more time freedom through passive real estate investing. Passive investing in real estate challenges conventional investment wisdom. We are passionate about learning and sharing resources with others who are ready to transform their investing mindset. Quick disclaimer as always, I am not a CPA, I am not an attorney or a financial advisor. This is not financial advice, not telling you or anyone else what to do. The views and opinions expressed in these podcasts are provided for education and informational purposes only and are not necessarily the views of my employer, ADP. I'm glad you're here. Now let's dig in.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Freedom Point Real Estate Podcast. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Drew McWilliams, and I will be your host. Today, my guest is Brian Chou, who is an attorney with Barth Calderon Law Firm. Brian is a certified specialist in estate planning, trust, and probate law. Brian has his law degree and MBA from Pepperdine University, and is extremely well-versed in business asset protection. Brian assists clients in all stages of life, from the young professional couple that is concerned about estate planning for their children, to the wealthy real estate investor who wants to insulate himself and properties from lawsuits, to the successful business owner. Brian resides in Orange County, California, and enjoys surfing. And lastly, I will personally endorse Brian as he has done an amazing job doing the asset protection, estate, and trust planning for myself and my family, and has made an extremely enjoyable experience from what I think could really have been overwhelming and tedious. So thank you, Brian, for joining us. Glad to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Brian, I'd love to open up. Just tell us and the audience a little bit about yourself, your company, and your role of what you do, other than the background we just did.
Sure. Yeah, thanks again for having me. So what I do primarily is I'm an asset protection and estate planning attorney, right? So what I primarily help my clients to do day in and day out is to structure their assets to make it more difficult for people to sue them, and then ultimately to help them to transition those assets to their children or other loved ones or charity in a way that minimizes their taxes and their headaches while accomplishing whatever their legacy goals may be.
Great. That's great. So what is it that I guess is the most concerning to people that work with you? What are they worried about, losing that wealth that they've created over the years? Or is it, passing on what they've earned to the next generation? What seems to be top of mind to people?
Yeah, it'll vary, right? So clients, as you probably know, come in all different shapes and sizes. And so I think you had kind of alluded to that in your introduction, which is, right, one example of a client would be, like you talked about before, right, that young professional couple, they're really just starting out, but they have high earning potential. And maybe they just had their first or second child, and they're really hot to trot in making sure that they have, their basic estate plan in place, their guardianship appointments, powers of attorney, so that if anything happens to them, they die or become incapacitated, that there's a plan in place, their wishes are clearly articulated, and that the right people have the ability to step in and either take care of them or perhaps take care of their children, right? And to make sure that that's all kind of thoughtfully done and set forth. Then as people progress through life and they start accumulating more assets, then oftentimes asset protection becomes a huge issue, right? So it may be, hey, I've got several millions of dollars of real estate, investment properties. What happens if one of my tenants gets hurt or a contractor gets hurt on the property? How do I insulate myself from those liabilities? Or what happens if I get into a car accident? Or maybe I'm an orthopedic surgeon and I get sued for malpractice. How do I shelter these assets from those liabilities that come from my business activities or just my personal activities, right? And then also, as people accumulate assets, another concern is then, hey, when I pass these assets to my loved ones, if I have if I'm a high net worth individual, there will be taxes. The government will put taxes on my assets when I pass them from one generation to the next, based on the value of those assets at the time of my passing. And so then that also becomes a concern as well. So how do we structure these assets to further shelter them from estate taxes? Because um, obviously, a penny saved is a penny earned, as Benjamin Franklin said. So, what are the things that we can do to then ensure that we can get more of these assets to the kids without the government taking a big chunk out of it?
So two things there that just kind of resonate with me. And I know we've been working together now for a while personally. So let's talk about number one. And I know a lot of people that are going to listen to this tune in just for the real estate aspect of it, right? So this is kind of a bonus aspect that we're doing today. A tenant slips and falls and sues you is definitely a concern. There's no doubt about that when you have a brick and mortar. So, I mean, what is the answer? How does someone insulate themselves if they have a rental property so a tenant doesn't slip and fall and come after your personal assets or their brick and mortar rental property, quite honestly?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways of kind of dealing with this, and what is fun about my practice is every client is different, right? Every client has a different family situation, different assets, different life philosophies, and different goals. And so there's a number of ways to kind of tailor things to kind of help the client to accomplish their goals. But let's just try to answer generally. So if I had a rental property and I was concerned about the liability from that property attaching to me or my other assets, probably the first thing that we will consider in most cases is putting that property into an LLC or a limited liability company. And essentially what that is you're creating a separate business, right? So many of your audience probably know what an LLC is, but for those who don't, right, people will form corporations or LLCs or other business entities as a way to insulate themselves from personal liability, or to insulate them from the liabilities of the business, right? So states essentially have a public policy interest in incentivizing people to start businesses, because businesses create jobs and businesses grow the economy. And so one of the ways that they'll do that is they'll say, hey, look, if you, in order to make it easier for you to start this business, we'll allow you to create an entity that's separate from you. So if I create Brian Chou Properties LLC, that is now its own separate business with its own assets and liabilities. So now if something goes wrong within that business, that liability generally should stay or should only be attachable within the assets of that business, right? Because it's now its own thing separate from me. So now if I put that property into Brian Chou Properties, tenant slips and falls on that property, then they should only be able to go after the assets of that LLC, not my other rental properties, my other businesses, my primary residence, my cash and marketable securities, etc. And so that's usually kind of the first thing that we'll kind of look at, right? And so beyond that, there's other ways of also protecting these assets, right? You might say, hey, not only am I concerned about sheltering these assets from the assets of the rental property, but let's say that rental property has a lot of equity, right? How might we protect the equity in that LLC or in that rental property from a liability that might occur on the property, right? Because if that equity is still in the LLC, it's still attachable by creditors, right? And so one way that you might address that is you could put a line of credit or take more cash out of the equity. So you strip the equity out of the property, and then you take that out of the LLC and you put it into another, let's say, real estate investment, or put it into some other asset protection entity, right? So thirdly, if you might have rental properties, but you might also have, let's say, large cash holdings or investments, and you might say, okay, maybe we'll create an irrevocable trust, or maybe we'll create some other LLC to hold the cash and the marketable securities, so that even if a creditor can come after us personally, or they break through they pierce the corporate veil of the LLC for some reason, that they still have to break into this other entity that's more difficult for creditors to reach. So those are some examples of things that we would consider when we're talking about asset protection as it pertains to a real estate portfolio or the potential liabilities stemming from that. So,
yeah, and one thing that you've personally taught me over the last 30 days, I think our audience knows I own a couple of rental properties. I'm fortunate that one of them is owned free and clear, and you actually taught me that actually could be a negative because I don't have a first line of defense of a mortgage company or a lien or a creditor in place to potentially protect me, heaven forbid, if someone would slip and fall. I'm the first line of defense, me, myself, and I.
yeah, and your insurance policy.
And my insurance policy, that is an accurate statement. So learning about the trusts and other things to be able to put more lines of defense in place has really been a game changer and helping me sleep a lot more at night, having that asset protection in place. So
yep,
I appreciate that.
Oh, right. Actually, if you don't mind, I might address insurance as well, because this is a common question that pops up, which is, so a lot of times clients will say, look, I've got $1 million umbrella policy. Do I really need to engage in this other asset protection? And the answer is, well, you don't have to do anything you don't want to do, right? But the reason why oftentimes clients will choose to engage in asset protection is beyond insurance, is that insurance is not a panacea, right? It doesn't cure everything. So there are some drawbacks to insurance or shortcomings of insurance that asset protection kind of fills the gap in. So one is insurance doesn't cover everything, right? So if you look at your insurance policies, you might see page 1 deals with what's covered, pages 2 through 15 deal with what's excluded, right? And so if something occurs and it's not covered by the insurance policy, obviously that's a problem, right? Another problem is the insurance company might cover it and they might not, right? So there's this inherent potential conflict between the insurance company and policyholders, right? Because they're incentivized to withhold payment as much as possible, and the policyholders' interest is to get the policy paid out, right? And so if you have a dispute with the insurance company about what they'll cover while you're getting sued, that's also a problem because now you're fighting a two-front war. A third issue is that there are limits to the policy, right? So if you have $1 million policy, but a $3 million loss, that's still a $2 million problem, right? And so where asset protection, these asset protection structures and insurance kind of work hand in hand is the insurance kind of acts like the low-hanging fruit for your creditors to chase after. And the hard asset protection structures that we put in are designed to make it such that our creditors can't come after those assets. And so the analogy that I would use is like if you go camping, right? So if you go camping, usually you don't put your igloo cooler in the tent where your kids are sleeping, right? You want to put it like in a tree somewhere where if a bear comes, they can chase after the igloo cooler, not after your kids. And so that's what the insurance does, is it's, again, that bright, shiny thing that a creditor can say, oh, that there's a pot of money for me to try to reach. And if the tent is built out of, Kevlar or, whatever, if it's a very secure tent, then that creates further disincentives for creditors to come after you. The other thing that is oftentimes overlooked with regards to insurance is clients oftentimes assume that if they built, this castle with a moat around it and they harmed somebody, that they would just sit, in the castle and laugh about it, right? But the truth of the matter is most people are moral individuals, right? So if you did genuinely harm somebody, the insurance allows you the liquidity to make things right. But the asset protection structures that we implement allow you to do it on your terms rather than a plaintiff's attorney being able to dictate those terms to you. And so that's how they kind of work hand in hand with one another.
So what about your primary residence? I mean, is it of importance to put your primary residence into a trust? I know we've been talking about investment properties specifically because we're worried about tenants, but what about your own house?
Yeah, so a primary residence, there are a number of things you can do with regards to your primary residence. I think for one, we'll start with this whole idea of putting the property into a living trust, right? So the most common type of trust that people will see out there are living trusts or revocable living trusts. These are kind of like your mom and pop family trusts. And a lot of times people assume that if they put their property into a living trust, that those are now protected from their liabilities because they've, transferred the property out of their name into the name of the trust. And the answer there, that's a common misperception. So a revocable living trust is really designed for succession purposes. So it's designed so that if you die or become incapacitated, that the right people can step in and manage the property and ultimately distribute it to your kids or other loved ones in accordance with whatever your wishes or instructions are. But it does not create any meaningful asset protection. And the reason why it doesn't create any asset protection benefit is because these types of trusts are what are called revocable trusts, which means that you, as the creator of the trust, retain the ability to make changes or adjustments to the trust up to and including completely getting rid of the trust. So if you revoke or undo the trust, the assets just come back to you and now they're subject to your liabilities. And so if you retain that big string to pull those assets back into your name, then a judge can compel you to pull those assets back into your name and thereby expose them to your creditors. And so when doing asset protection for the primary residence, putting it into a living trust doesn't really do anything from an asset protection standpoint. So what we will do will depend on the particulars of the client. So there is something out there called a homestead exemption, right? So each state has certain protections that they will provide to their citizens. And so kind of going back to this whole idea of public policy, right? So states have a public policy interest in you not becoming penniless in the event that something bad happens to you. The idea here being is that if a creditor were able to take everything that you own, then you would then end up on welfare, and the state doesn't want you to end up on welfare because they don't want the responsibility of taking care of you. And so because of that, states will say, okay, certain things, assets will receive some measure of protection so that even if the poop hits the proverbial fan, that you still have some assets available to you to kind of get back on your feet. And so most states will have a homestead exemption, which protects a certain portion of the equity in your home. I think, so for example, if you live in Texas or Florida, you have an unlimited homestead exemption. So you can have a $20 million house and that's protected from your creditors, which is pretty amazing. California currently has an exemption that ranges between, let's just call it $350,000 to $650,000, just depending on the county in which you live. I think North Carolina was pretty small. It was like 75,000. So,
I don't even think it was that much, Brian. I think it was a lot less when we looked at it. Yeah.
So if you live in a state like Texas or Florida, you might not need to do anything more, right, to protect your primary residence. But if you live but most states are not that generous, right? So, so in those cases, there are certainly a number of things that we could potentially implement to protect the primary residence. So one example would be a residential shield trust, right? So this would be a trust that is designed to hold your primary residence within a structure that has a high degree of asset protection. And so the residential shield trust primarily is designed to do two things. It's designed to, one, remove your name from title to the property. So some clients are really concerned about publicity or anonymity, right? So they want to keep their name off the public record. And so this is one way for them to remove their name from title to the property so that if somebody were doing a search for, let's just say in this case, Drew McWilliams, right, that liability or that search wouldn't be obvious that you are the beneficial owner of that property because it would be held in an innocuously named trust with somebody else as the trustee. So let's say, another family member of yours, or in many cases, it'll be me, right, who would be the trustee. But the way that works is then the trust is set up in such a way that the trustee has no obligation, has no authority to take action except at the express direction of the beneficiary. So in this case, if I were the trustee of this residential shield trust and I'm the one sitting on title to your primary residence, I would not actually be able to do anything with that property unless you specifically directed me to do so. So like I wouldn't be able to refinance your house without you telling me to do so, right? And so what would then happen within that residential shield trust is we would then assign that beneficial interest in that trust into an LLC. And we would usually create that LLC in a state that has strong asset protection laws like Delaware, Wyoming, or Nevada. And so then that's also designed to further make it more difficult for creditors to reach the equity in your home. And so, that's just one example of something that you might do to protect a primary residence. There's certainly a number of other things that we would consider for the client depending on their situation. Usually it will vary based on the state in which they live, and then also if they're married, right? If they're married, oftentimes there are things that we can do to structure assets between a husband and a wife to make it more difficult for creditors to reach those assets as well. So,
yeah. And one thing that you kind of dropped a little bit earlier, just to unpack, different state LLCs have different benefits to them. That being said, 60 days ago, I just had LLCs where I live or have brick and mortar properties. And now in the last 60 days, in speaking with you and others, I now have LLCs in Wyoming, Montana, and Nevada all of a sudden. And I won't unpack on this show exactly why I have them in each of those. I'll leave that for people to contact you, but there's definitely benefits every state has with different LLCs. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. So yeah, different states have different laws. And so some states, from a philosophical standpoint, design their laws to protect their citizens more than others, or to protect the businesses that are formed in those states better. And so, yeah.
Perfect. I appreciate that. Well, I think we've done a great job. I know we're getting kind of to the end of our time here together with our listeners and yourself. So I really am glad we were able to unpack kind of the trusts. I'm really glad you went into the residential shield trust, which was completely eye-opening to me whenever we've been talking about that. Really the other thing we didn't get to unpack that today, maybe we'll be able to do that on a second time, is man, I hate paying taxes and would love to avoid whatever taxation that I can. And I know that is something that you are able to do in a legal way with how the trusts are set up by avoiding taxation for future generations, not necessarily the here and now for me. So I think that is something extremely powerful that we didn't really get to go and unpack today, but I know you have that ability and keen sense as well for any of our listeners that wanted to go more in depth about that. Last question for you, Brian, before we kind of end our time today, that I always like to end on. Can you tell me a little bit about your highs, lows, and what you've learned along your professional journey thus far?
Sure. So as to what I've learned along the way, I mean, I think, from a professional journey standpoint, and maybe just personal, right, is I try to surround myself with good people. So I kind of look at everything through the lens of relationships. So identify good people, maintain those relationships. And yeah, if you're around people that you like and trust, then good things tend to happen. And you don't even have to really try that hard to make it happen. It just kind of happens. And so, so that's kind of how I try to live my life, is just always be on the lookout for good people and put in the effort to maintain those relationships. So
I love that. That's awesome. Yeah. Well, Brian, thanks again for your time. If any of our audience wants to reach out and connect with you and learn a little bit more, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Sure. So probably best way is to shoot me an email. I don't know if you can post this anywhere, but it's Brian, BRIAN, at Barth, B as in boy, A as in apple, R as in Robert, T as in Thomas, H as in Harry, attorneys, attorneys.com. If you reach out and you want to connect, I'll send you a link to my calendar, and you can just pick a time to either schedule a brief phone call to answer initial questions, or if you want to set a formal consultation, you'll have the option to do that as well. So.
Perfect. I love it. Brian, thanks again for your time and all the knowledge that you were able to give our listeners. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for hanging out with us today and for listening to the Freedom Point podcast, powered by Starting Point Capital. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Nothing said on this show should be considered financial advice. Before making any financial decision, please consult with a professional. This show is copyrighted by the Freedom Point podcast. Written permissions must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting. If you're interested in connecting, you can find contact information at startingpointcapital.com.